for the introduction. I have written a little bit about these things in the book and in some other books, and I think the case of Britain is quite an interesting one. So I'm going to talk about Corbynism, populism, and Brexit, and I'm going to talk about nationalism, international cooperation, and the potentiality of transnationalism. And I thought to start with this schema that after Pano's presentation, I'm sure we have to add or change things and so on, but let's start with these things and we can develop it maybe further. So usually we are talking about national people within the nation state and against national elites, but for the British case at least, we are talking about national people against international elites and institutions. I don't use the term transnational elites and institutions there because, again, within the EU institutions, there are very strong national interests that they play a role. So national people for Brexit, I would say, against international elites. And then in other cases, like Panos was talking in terms of Diem, the creation of a transnational people, again, against international elites. Again, we may want to change these international elites to transnational because somebody used the term, I think, as well. But I think in a simplified way, this will be different ways of understanding where the creation of the people is taking place and against who they are fighting for. Again, as I said, it may need additions. In the Brexit case, it will be the second one. Now, there are a lot of things to say about Brexit and the particularity of the British case. Usually, in history and in politics, whenever we refer to Britain, it's always a particular case, the peculiarity of the British. And there are reasons for that. I think one of them is that they don't have necessarily the same political reservoir as other groups, movements, and parties in Europe. But what is the particularity of the British case in what I'm trying to say? When we are looking at populism and left populism, I think the British case is quite important because it is a failed populist moment of creating a people around the idea of Corbynism and against neoliberalism and austerity. There was an attempt there, something was happening that it makes us talk about populism and Corbynism, but I don't think it's very convincing. I'll talk about it in a minute. And also, if you look at it, I would look at it as a failed moment. There was the opposite project as well from the side of a particular right-wing people. Again, in terms of how we are going to define it, I'm not using the nativist, for example, term that you use, but I will call the Eurosceptic, I will call it Eurosceptic left or the populist left. Some people will disagree about how much Boris Johnson was a populist. Again, in these two different cases and in these two different discourses that they were happening in Britain, one from the left and one from the right, from the left, Corbynism, anti-austerity, from the right, Brexit, we can see also another difference in terms of populism. So in the case of Corbynism, a lot of people, they are trying to read it as grassroots populism, and they try to refer it back to the movements against austerity, which I think, again, it is a little bit misguided. Of course, on the ground, there were grievances and the austerity grievances, but also grievances that the Eurosceptic discourse managed to bring together and move towards Brexit. It's just that in the Johnson case, because I see it more as a top-down project, which nevertheless managed to incorporate a lot of the different grievances, many of which they didn't have anything to do with Brexit. Am I going too fast? Am I going too slow? Okay. Now, from what we were discussing before, there are some more theoretical considerations in relation to how we see populism. And it's not only on the level of theory, it has to do with how we understand populist political projects. So usually I like the definition of Laclau, which talks about populist logic or populist reason and so on. It is much, much broader and talks in a different way about articulations, discourses, the role of agency in there and so on. Chantal, on the other hand, uses the idea of populist strategy. And I find this much more problematic. And the reason why it is more problematic, it had to do with some of the things that we were discussing before. So how left populists are going to stop something. It is very voluntaristic, this idea, for me. It is as if we all get together here and we think about a good populist project, this populist project, it is our strategy and it will bring electoral success. I think it oversimplifies things and it also makes things sound very voluntaristic. This discussion and why I don't like this idea of strategy, it could refer back to some of the ideas of Laclau, but also the underpinnings of discourse analysis and the role of structure and agency there, which Laclau's way it is in between the two. Yeah, there are structures which are not that rigid and are discourses and they modify us in a certain way. They have an impact on us, but that doesn't mean that they totally block every agency. The reason is that at a certain moment, we can see the undecidability of different discourses and possibly there is a potential of taking quite conscious decisions there. Like in the case of Podemos, for example, that you have the movements and then you say, okay, there is the ground there that we can have a political party. But in most cases, I don't think things are a matter of agency only. It has to do with how different discourses come together and they open up or foreclose certain possibilities. And I also think that in order to be able to trace these possibilities and these obstacles in having a populist, successful populist project, it has to do with different levels of analysis as well. So one of the way to differentiate and be able to look at the analysis is through two different levels. First is looking within a party and the discourse of the party and what it blocks, for example, certain options there, but also the interplay between parties. How, for example, a potential left populist project finds in front of it a right wing, which stops it because it has already defined the terrain in a particular way, which is what I think it happened in Britain. So in terms of left populism, a lot of people look at Corbynism. And Corbyn was elected as a leader of the Labour Party in two different occasions in 2015 and 16. And a lot of people, because of grassroots populism and the idea of the left that we have, they try to connect it with the movements, the anti-austerity movements that we had before the election of Corbyn in Britain. There is a problem there. The problem is the definition of a movement, what will constitute a movement. And I will put a question mark in the case of Britain. This doesn't mean that there were not different mobilizations and the austerity mobilizations I'm talking about before Corbyn. There were quite a few. 2010, there were big student demonstrations that they were against the introduction of fees in universities, which then this group became part or a big part of that supporters of Corbyn. Other people refer to the anti-austerity demonstrations in Britain. There were different ones. Some that were called by unions, TUC, for example, in 2011, and there was the biggest one in 2015. The problem there for populism is that a lot of people who were involved in this movement, they know that it was defined by people who are the traditional, let's say, left and very much against populism. I have a story here. I'll say the story. I hope I have time, yeah? When this demonstration happened, anti-austerity demonstration, 2015 in London, there were different speakers. There were the usual suspects, people from unions, people from the Labour Party, Corbyn was there, and so on. But there was no representative of Podemos. They would hate Podemos, the organizers, the people who were from the traditional left. They wouldn't have somebody from Podemos. It's a totally different logic that they hated. Although there was a big campaign for Greece, which defined quite a lot of the politics, solidarity politics that they were happening in Britain, again, there was a resistance to allow anybody to talk for Syriza. I was the person to talk for Syriza at the end. But that means at the same time, and this goes to the discussion, Oscar, that we had before, a lot of my friends that they were working with the Greek Solidarity campaign and so on, they had to give a fight. I wasn't involved. But again, there was a resistance. People were fighting in order to allow somebody from Syriza to talk there. So you have this, they call it movement, but it is very much defined by the traditional left, and it doesn't manage to break much more widely in British society. One reason for that, it has to do with how deep was the dislocation that you had after the financial crisis in Britain. And it wasn't the same as in Greece or Spain, for example. What do I mean by that? I mean that the affiliations of people towards political parties and towards the British political establishment, it wasn't loosened up in the same way that we had in Britain and Spain. People were still supporting Labour, maybe they wanted a different Labour, but there wasn't even the same discussion that we had in the movements of the squares in relation to direct democracy, other potential forms of democracy. This crisis, that it was a crisis of political representation as well for Greeks and Spanish, it wasn't the same in Britain. I'm looking at you because you are the Spanish representative here. Okay, now we'll look at you. So there were quite a lot of differences with what was happening in Britain as opposed to Greece and Spain in relation to the demands, the movements, the questions of political representations, and so on. Again, there is something else as well. I mean, there was a big demonstration. There were different groups, but it was usually the traditional left that it was working for anti-austerity. So it never became this first ground of demands that they come together and so on, and then they will move to electoral challenge. There are other reasons as well, but they have to do with the particular discourses of the different parties. So I will start first by talking about Labour and what was happening inside Labour in relation to the movements or the mobilizations that they existed before, and then I will move to the Conservatives, and then I will try to deal with both of them together. So as I said, there were mobilizations, a lot of people were involved, but usually people, activists from the left and younger people as well. And they created momentum, which was the campaign for the election of Jeremy Corbyn to the leadership of the Labour Party. And in the first instance, they were envisioning momentum as something quite open. This, of course, never materialized. And if anybody knows the Labour Party, there was no way that it will materialize. So this group and other groups who had participated in anti-austerity movements, they became part of momentum, which was then incorporated and aligned within party politics. That means that you couldn't be in momentum if you are not a Labour Party member. Yeah. Already, what momentum meant had quite had shifted quite a lot, and I wouldn't describe momentum as a movement anymore. It was more like a pressure group within the Labour Party, which was at the beginning campaigning for Corbyn, and then it was pushing for and supporting left leadership and the turn of the Labour Party via Corbyn towards the left. There were other reasons as well why this populist movement couldn't take off in Britain. The Labour Party, which incorporated some of the anti-austerity activities, was also in government in 2010, when during the time of the financial crisis, 2007-8 until 2010. So it was the Labour Party, which now it was called to play the anti-austerity role and say something, but it was a part of it is a part of the political establishment. So if we can talk about populism in relation to Corbynism, it will have to do with this process within the party, creating a people, but as a people within the party, bringing together groups within the party, young groups, more left people that they had left the party, which joined and so on. And it had to do with this moment of where you have a people within the party that they are pushing for something else. Now, a lot of people, they look further at what the discourse of the Labour Party was under Corbyn, the manifestos, for example, that they were coming out from the Labour Party, and the manifesto of 2017 was entitled "For the Many, Not the Few." It could be a very good populist motto, but it's not enough. There are other things that they should happen in order to talk about left populism and the Labour Party. The focus of the party, it wasn't to change the political establishment, it wasn't to change the way liberal democracy was operating in, it wasn't putting questions about direct democracy, representation, and so on, but what it came out from this manifesto of the 2017 of the Labour Party, it was an attempt to democratize but economic governance. And this wasn't coming exactly from Corbyn's office, it was coming from John McDonnell, and the idea there was that it wasn't only about nationalizing the rails, for example, basic utilities and so on, but creating a different way of governance that will bring different groups in, the community in, and so on. The biggest problem, however, for me, in relation to what was happening within the Labour Party, it was that it couldn't have a populist discourse because it had a lot of much older understanding of class politics, which were quite prevalent within the Labour Party. So while we, or you would expect other parties like Syriza or Podemos talking about the people, the concern within the Labour Party was the northern heartlands that potentially, they are traditionally voters of Labour. This idea, it has been also described as the red wall. If the Labour Party is going to lose the red wall, the working class communities of the north, but it is also called red wallism for a lot of us that we want to criticize this insistence of the Labour Party with class politics in a way that it doesn't follow where political things are at the current moment. What do I mean by that is that in these elections, but also the elections that follow, the main support of the Labour Party is the big cities. It is the north, but Manchester. It is London, and it's almost the whole of London. So this idea of, oh, but we lost, or we have to regain the traditional working class communities, it blocks a populist discourse, and I'm not necessarily sure how much it describes something which was even in the past there. Now, what was happening within the Conservatives? First of all, again, the story of Brexit starts with a referendum, which was probably promised by Cameron in 2012. The reason behind that, it was to deal with the Eurosceptic faction within the Conservative Party. Of course, if we look at the theory of referendums, although they are quite often associated with direct democracy, in most cases, historically, that is not the role they have played. It is a way to deal with factions. It is a way to take decisions that possibly a government is afraid to take. In other cases, probably more in Scandinavian countries, it's something that it happens more routinely for different reasons, and you ask people quite often what they think on something. But this association of the referendum for parts of the left with direct democracy, it doesn't stand necessarily historically. The referendum happens, the Brexit side wins, and we have a change of leadership from from Cameron first to Theresa May, and then from Theresa May to Boris Johnson. And this is the big change within the party when Boris Johnson comes to power. Now, in terms of the discourse that Johnson, and I don't mean only him, but I mean his collaborators, advisors, and so on, are promoting, it is something between national protectionism. We have to get out of the EU because that's the only way that we can help ailing industries, as opposed to the state rules that we have in EU, state aid rules that we have in EU law. And one of his main advisors, Cummings, who was also leading the Leave campaign, it was a form of neoliberalism that he was promoting, but turbo. So he will call himself libertarian. I don't like when the left uses the word libertarian because I thought we have appropriated on the left, but okay, Cummings was using that. And again, in this extreme neoliberalism, this libertarianism of Cummings, the EU was an obstacle. There was another, so the discussion within the Conservative Party, it was mainly about Brexit. Austerity wasn't anymore, and now we are talking about 2015, 16, yeah. Austerity wasn't something that the right was trying to defend ideologically. This was happening when the crisis happened, why we need cuts and so on. They had moved by that time quite far from that. And later on, although of course there were austerity policies at place and there were cuts and so on, their public discourse was much more about helping the economy, spending and so on. We saw that with the pandemic as well, which the chancellor gave some money, of course, in the economy. I don't mean that they are not neoliberal, by the way. They are neoliberal, but the discourse had changed and they had moved away from trying to justify austerity. Another thing that it was happening by having Brexit as a nodal point for the Conservative Party under Johnson and making a much bigger project out of that, and why it was successful within the Labour Party is because national sovereignty was quite successful, I think, in their discourse, equated with popular sovereignty. So the referendum was the will of the people, the demand of the people. If the people need to be sovereign, and that means that Britain has to be sovereign and not having the EU anymore imposing laws and whatever. So on the one hand, we have the Labour Party, which insists on anti-austerity, anti-neoliberalism discourse with Corbyn, but then the debate has shifted and Brexit is the main issue in politics around that time, which has been appropriated by the Conservative Party. Brexit was from the beginning defined by the right. I'm saying that because a lot of people will say, oh, but Corbyn should have come out for Remain, or oh, Corbyn should have come out for Brexit. In either case, what Brexit means and how Brexit will be materialized, it had been defined by the right. One of the ways that it was defined by the right, it was in terms of its timing and time scale. And the Labour Party under Corbyn was just trying to catch up with what was going on. So in relation to triggering Article 50, which is starting the process of moving out of the EU, the moment the right was calling for triggering Article 50, at a moment when it wasn't clear what Brexit would mean, what the negotiations would be about, what will be the position of the government, and so on. But Corbyn was pushed, let's say, immediately to say, yeah, we have to trigger Article 50. The urgency and the fear that if you don't trigger in Article 50, it will make you the enemy of the people. It was making the Labour Party trailing what Conservatives were doing. So within the Labour Party, sovereignty was defined as parliamentary sovereignty as opposed to the popular national sovereignty that we had within the Brexit Party. What do I mean by that? It means that the whole discussion of sovereignty for Labour was associated with parliamentary procedures. For example, when the European Union withdrawal bill was introduced, Labour was talking about how this, it's the Henry VIII clauses to show that the government would have a lot of power to change a lot of legislation, and there should be more scrutiny from the side of Labour. The same also happened in 2019 when Boris Johnson wanted to suspend Parliament between August and October because there was, again, an impasse around that, and it was in a way blackmailing with a hard Brexit. The answer of the Labour Party was to talk about how undemocratic this was, which was, I mean, that was a decision of the Supreme Court as well, that it was undemocratic, how we should have more control over a parliamentary procedure, how we shouldn't let the Tories do whatever they want, and so on. So the timing of Brexit is defined by the right, the Labour is trailing, and it's this idea of which Johnson was very convincingly managed to put forward, that there is an urgency and an emergency to do Brexit as fast as we can, which is captured in his motto as well, get Brexit done, and so on. So what I try to show is separately the two different discourses within the parties. Now I'm trying to bring the two in a dialogue, let's say, and show similarities around Brexit. Now, throughout the party's history and in relation to the relationship with the EU, there were many different discourses within each party, what the EU means, how we understand the EU, and so on. The more dominant one within the Conservative Party, it was the liberal economic community. So it was focusing on economic outcome. This goes back to Thatcherism. So the idea there, it was that we are interested in the economic outcome. Politics are not very important there. And this is why Thatcher was also supporting the solving disputes with the in European court. So the idea there is that we don't need any questions about politics or governance. It's a legal matter. We are interested in the economic outcome. If there is some dispute, let's go to court and let's solve it there. The problem is that there's a similar discourse with something extra. It was the dominant one within the Labour Party. I'm not talking about Corbyn now, Johnson. I'm talking about the dominant discourses within the parties as a whole. So for the Labour Party, the dominant discourse, it was the social democratic community discourse. Again, the idea was on the economic outcome, but they were also connected with issues like justice, unemployment, and so on. What both dominant discourses have in both parties is the clear division between economic and the political, and the emphasis on the economic. Through these two main discourses, there were alternatives, of course, within the parties as well. So these two discourses defined the two main Remain campaigns. I'm not talking about Johnson and Corbyn again. I'm talking about the rest of the parties, let's say, which they were focusing on the economic benefits or the economic problems with Brexit. And this is how Brexit played mainly in the public discourse. What economic problems will we have? Will the economy go down? What are we going to do with trade, and so on? This is how it was played in the mainstream, Remain from Conservative and the Labour Party. Corbynism didn't have that much to say in relation of Brexit. I'm going to qualify that because it's a little bit unfair, but I'm going to qualify that. So in the discussions within the Labour Party under Corbyn, the idea was about the national economic governance. As I said, it comes from the manifestos as well, but there was not that much about the EU. And if there was something that it will go beyond the national for Corbynism, it would be international cooperation, which could happen within the international, some will call them transnational institutions of the EU, and by being part of the same European parties family. This, as somebody said, it was translated in everyday politics, that if we manage to elect Corbyn and other social democrats or left governments, this will change the trajectory of the EU, but without problematizing all the structures or having new proposals. As I said, Johnson, with the take back control, it had more to say on the national level about the economic and the political. The take back control, it was against the EU institutions in relation to governance. He was also talking about international cooperation, but in a different way, with a lot of empire nostalgia in there. So when there would be a question about, yeah, but we need people to work, we need labor hands, what is going to happen with that if we have Brexit? We will take it from, this has happened to me, from our colonies. This was said by a left person who was in favor of Brexit. I asked afterwards to get the video, but it had disappeared. So it was a very strong idea of the empire. We have the Commonwealth, we have different connections there, and for a part of the left, but also for Johnson, it will be the answer to a lot of things. So we want more people to work in Britain. Why don't we get more from India? The fact that they have totally destroyed India and all the racism that all these people have suffered within Britain as well, it was a secondary matter. Now, what I was trying to say, I don't know if I made it clear, is that in Labour we have different impasses that they are happening at the same time. Corbyn wants to talk about austerity. The discussion has moved to Brexit. Even if Corbyn wanted to unite different grievances and cut through society in a much broader way, there was always this class element within Labour, what I said, the red wallism, that it was blocking certain decisions, and it was also blocking a lot of decisions that they were taking in relation to Brexit. So Brexit becomes a big obstacle for the Labour Party under Corbyn, and the decision is to take a position, sorry, I'm here, of ambiguity. Am I here? Sorry. So Labour adopts this ambiguity, constructive ambiguity, as Varoufakis would say, which is not going with either side. We have to remember that 2/3 of the Labour members and a lot say, and voters, I think, they were pro-Remain. Yeah? But there was the question about what would happen with those left behind in the red wall constituencies and so on. So the answer was, let's be ambiguous about it, which it didn't work. Also, a lot of other alternatives that they were played at the same time inside the Labour Party were blocked as well. Some of these I was involved. That's why I'm using this campaign. One was Another Europe is Possible, but this was cross-party with people from the Labour Party, which was trying to advance a left Remain position, which, however, will be more critical of the EU institutions and so on. Within the Labour Party, one of the campaigns, there were others as well, it was something that it was called the People's Vote in the first instance, which then changed to Public Vote. That was the name of the campaign. The People's Vote, when the name became the People's Vote, it was an attempt again to play with populism and so on, which the Public Vote, the idea that there should be another vote on the agreement that the Conservative Party will bring in country, so put the agreement into voting. It became a public vote because it was translated within it aligns again better with the Labour Party position, which is parliamentary processes, and we want the people in to be able to scrutinize any deal that it will come. Now, this marginalization is expressed on how policy was decided within the Labour Party. I gave two examples here. In 2018, for example, 150 of Labour local branches passed a motion that we should leave open the possibility of this public vote, that the public would scrutinize.
You mean a second referendum?
Yes, which there was a reason why.
But to subvert the results of the first referendum.
This is why it wasn't called the second referendum. This is politics, yeah, because it will be something. If it was a second referendum, it will mean that we want to subvert the first. It was described as a vote on the agreement that it will come back from the negotiations. But yeah, you're right, you can say it like that, but there is a reason why this is not the phrase. Yes, potentially, but let's discuss that. 2019, again, in party conference where the policy is decided, there is a motion 13 about active campaigning in favor of Remain, which is rejected in the conference. Of course, if anybody has been in conferences, they know how this play. It's a little bit, well, there are a lot of different groups that they are fighting over something. In this case, the Remain was rejected. What it was agreed, however, in 2019 is that this was approved by the conference, which means that it should become policy for the party. So in 2019, what is voted is that the deal that the Conservatives will make should be brought to Parliament, and there should be another public vote. That was voted in favor, and that was supposed to be party policy. This was motion 2014. So I'm trying to show you the different dynamics that existed in the party. And there is nothing certain. The idea is how things are going to be articulated, who the people are, and so on. In the Labour Party, it was what it defined them is this ambiguity. I'm not, although I remain, I campaigned for Remain, I didn't remain. I can see both sides, but there was a reason that taking either position, it was quite problematic for the Labour Party. So I've said this big story. I like this big story, but I think there are quite a lot of things that this Brexit case could help us think. Okay, we have national people against international institutions. The international institutions, I mean the EU institutions, but they are very much modified in relation to the national context and the party discourses. The question is, are we going, where is transnational populism coming into that? And transnational populism, I mean in relation to what I was saying at the beginning, having a transnational people against particular institutions and elites. So where are we today? The campaign for a second Scottish referendum has started. I think it will be quite different from the first campaign, and much more people will be willing to support it, because the dimension of Brexit and England deciding on Scotland leaving Brexit, this is how it is understood from the Scottish perspective, it will play a role. So the campaigning has started. There is a process, of course, if it will be approved by the Westminster and so on. Then we have the issue of Northern Ireland. Of course, it doesn't have to do only with Brexit or austerity. It has to do with the domination of Westminster. It has to do with the conflict, unionists, Republicans, and so on. But I think when this discussion will open about the Northern Ireland independence, there will be many more people in favor of that. I don't mean the people within Northern Ireland, that it is quite divided and so on, but I think that will be something that it could potentially bring together other people, transnational people. I'm not saying it's a transnational dimension, I'm talking about a little potential. Brexit again will play a role, the old conflicts, of course, but I think a lot of Republicans from other countries as well, they will be coming together at that point to support the Northern Irish cause for independence if we get to that point. This will happen, I think. The question will be posed in 5 years, 10 years. It's not something that is going to happen immediately. So we had national people against the international institutions. And I try to show how the positions of the parties were shaped and in relation to populism, but also to finish off with talking about potentiality of transnational people coming together around some of the issues that they were opened up with Brexit. And I will stop.